Welcome to the Life After Whipple Project. I'm Greg Adams, a pancreatic cancer survivor and current team leader. Nearly everyone who gets pancreatic cancer suffers some digestive problems. In fact, these problems are what often sends someone to the hospital, where this cancer is then discovered. Tonight, Dr. Howard Crawford and Nina Steele from Henry Ford's Pancreatic Cancer Center will review three things. One, how the digestive system normally functions. Two, what can go wrong because of the cancer and/or cancer treatment. And three, we hope to get into the effects these problems will have on nutrition. And there will be a Q&A at the end to discuss this. So to get started, here's Dr. Crawford and Dr. Steele.
Okay, Nina, you ready to go?
Sounds good.
Okay, so we are still going to schedule a nutritionist for you in the later meetings. So we're going to focus less on nutrition, but we definitely want to get a talk where you understand what the normal function of the digestive tract is, and we'll talk along the way about what the Whipple procedure compromises, and we'll do it in probably different styles from each other. And while Kathleen was very clear about putting stuff in the chat, we're a small group. I'm actually okay if you want to unmute, ask a question, interrupt, make sure if something's not clear. It's more important to me that you understand what we're saying, and not nearly as important for me to just talk. So with that, I think we'll get started. And oops, a little too fast. So this is just a slide that shows a cartoon of the digestive tract in general. And before we get to our featured guest, the pancreas, I want to make sure that you understand that it's much more complex than just the pancreas. So the digestive tract really starts in your mouth. And I'll talk about all the functions of the salivary glands in the mouth, and I'm going to talk about each one of these things. Mouth, it got down to the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine, eventually to the large intestine, and into the rectum. And the liver is part of the digestive tract in many senses, as is the gallbladder, as we'll talk about in detail, although they'll never directly come in contact with food, just as the pancreas will not. So, but they're very critical for your proper digestion. So, to put this into context so we can have a discussion about the normal function and what might be compromised, this gives you an opportunity to recognize, hey, you said this was gone after the Whipple, after I'm going through each one, and that's an opportunity for you to interrupt and say, okay, what about this function? You said this is gone, so let's talk about that for a second. I'm fine with that as an approach for this talk. Don't know why the B is off before, but okay, before the Whipple, after the Whipple. Before the Whipple, this is the part of the GI tract we're talking about. Of course, we're focusing on the pancreas. Pancreatic cancer normally forms in what's called the head of the pancreas, which is right up against the small intestine, particularly to the small intestine of the duodenum. There's no proper way to say it, and I've done this for 30 years, and everyone says it different. But when you have the Whipple, all these gray areas are what's going to be affected. So of the digestive tract, you're going to, of course, remove the part of the pancreas that contains the tumor. That's the whole point. And then you're going to take part of the stomach, not as clearly illustrated here, but you're going to take part of the stomach, as Nina will talk about. You'll take the duodenum, the small intestine. Sorry, I need to let somebody into the chat. And then you're going to rewire. The surgeon will rewire all of the different organs back together so that there's a general functionality that remains. So the part of the pancreas that does not have the tumor will not be removed. Get the laser pointer on, and then will be directly connected to the small intestine. But don't forget the duodenum has been largely removed in this case. So it's part of the small intestine, but not the duodenum. The stomach will be rewired separately. So it's not going directly into the small intestine, but is bypassed into the small intestine. So separately, they are now attached to the small intestine. And the gallbladder is completely removed, and the bile duct that leads into the gallbladder is attached again directly to the small intestine. So you have a feed into the small intestine, which is where a lot of your digestion is going to take place, from the pancreas, the stomach, and the bile duct, and all of those are critical for your digestion of your food. And we're going to talk about that in detail. So starting at the beginning, this is the fancy words for you're going to talk about your mouth and your salivary glands, really what it is. The thing about the salivary glands, okay, so yes, we know we all chew our food. That's an important process of digestion, no question. Mastication, grinding up your food into smaller chunks so that it can be digested by digestive enzymes. The first digestive enzymes that your food is going to see is coming from your salivary glands. And in fact, it's very funny, you know, as a person that's been working in this for a while, I was working briefly with somebody looking at salivary glands, and if you look closely at the salivary glands under the microscope, it looks exactly like the pancreas. So it gives you an idea that the main function of these glands is to produce the digestive enzymes, and some of the same digestive enzymes that the pancreas itself is going to produce. So you start to break down the food while it's still in your mouth. And of course, you're going to produce saliva. That's going to give you lubrication to be able to pass the food on into the esophagus. I'm sorry about the blurriness of this, but this is just a cartoon of the esophagus. The idea here is really quite simple, that the esophagus, just to bring it even to a simpler cartoon, is to just push the food from your mouth into your stomach. So there's going to be muscles in your esophagus that are going to pulsate with the food and then push the food down further and down further and down further, and then to closer into the stomach. There's not a lot of digestion, if any digestion, that happens here. There's more lubrication that will happen here, but not digestion. And I do believe that brings us to the stomach, which is where Nina is, who has a history with the stomach. So we're going to leave it to the experts to talk a little bit more about that. So
Yes.
Nina?
As Howard alluded, I actually studied the stomach in a lab in my PhD before I found my home studying the pancreas. So I know a little bit about stomach physiology and what the stomach is important for in the body, and also what can go wrong. And actually, before I got into pancreatic cancer, we were actually studying stomach cancer, which is a different kind of cancer, but still really important. And I don't know if I can progress the slides. Okay, but Howard will. Oh, it looks like my animations went away. I apologize about that. That's okay. So the stomach, very simply, is a really crucial digestive organ. I think we all know that the stomach produces some chemicals that are really important in breaking down larger food particles into smaller food particles, which will ultimately allow your body to absorb nutrients from food, which is one of the main goals of the digestive system itself. So what are these components? One component is actually hydrochloric acid. So this is a very, very strong acid, as well as pepsin, which is meat tenderizer. So both of these components will work together to help aid in the process of breaking down the food. But the stomach is also involved in some movement function. So you might feel your stomach growling or hear your stomach growling, and this vigorous mixing process, which you might hear referred to as peristalsis, results in a very highly acidic slurry of food particles about 1 millimeter in diameter. And, you know, in the past, it was thought that the environment in the stomach was totally sterile, meaning no bacteria. And this is usually true, but there are conditions that can happen. Stomach cancer is one of them that actually will allow for growth of some bacteria in the stomach. And you might have heard of a particular bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, which can actually survive this really harsh acidic environment.
Actually,
But
it's
the
pretty
stomach
cool.
is
I'm gonna
also,
jump in and just real quick, Nina, because I failed to mention about the esophagus is that the very end of the esophagus has a muscular area that blocks it off from the stomach. And so,
yes.
you know, when you hear about acid in the stomach and you hear about acid reflux, we're really talking about your esophagus that's getting exposed to acid it shouldn't be exposed to. And so that
Yep.
causes damage and wounding, and sometimes can also lead to esophageal cancer. So yeah, definitely it's important that you try to compartmentalize most of these organs away from each other based on what they're doing.
Yep, and that's true in the connection between the esophagus and stomach, and also a very important connection between the duodenum and the stomach as well for emptying those food particles into the duodenum under normal conditions, of course. So yeah, as I was mentioning, the stomach is also responsible for secreting several really important hormones as well. We don't have to get into the specific details of these, but these hormones are important for the absorption of key vitamins such as vitamin B12, as well as moderating the process of how emptying of those food particles that have been ground up by the stomach get to the small intestine in manageable amounts, right? You don't want this huge, giant mass of food just being dumped all at once. That would be too difficult for the small intestine to handle. So the stomach is in part responsible for breaking those particles down and allowing for ease of digestion later on. So this is just the general anatomy of the stomach. So the large curve on the outside is referred to as the greater curvature because it's bigger, and the lesser curvature is that inside small circular portion. And the stomach is, you might think of it as just, oh, it makes acid, it mixes up the food and, into this acidic slurry and breaks the food down by this vigorous motion. But there are very distinct regions of the stomach that actually contain different kinds of cells, and those cells in turn perform different functions for the process of digestion. And like I said earlier, one of those key roles of the different cell types is producing different hormones that regulate the whole gastrointestinal process, all the way from, initial food intake to evacuation of food as well. So the fundus is the upper portion, and then you have the body of the stomach, which is kind of the main portion. And then towards the end, as you get closer to the duodenum, you have the region referred to as the antrum, and then the pylorus. And then that pyloric sphincter is what controls that acidic slurry of food moving into the duodenum. And the stomach is wrapped with this very strong layer of muscle around it, and that's what allows that vigorous mixing motion. So you actually have to have a muscle there that's working and expending energy to do so. And then, above the muscle layer is what we refer to as the mucosa. And this is the layer in the stomach that is organized into these very specific folds, which allows for basically greater surface area for those cells to do the jobs that are important for them to do, like produce acid and produce the hormones. So this is how the stomach is generally organized.
So it's a good time also to mention the role of gravity. Try to swallow your food while you're lying down. Doesn't work terribly well. So your muscles need the help of gravity. And the reason I bring it up is because of exactly the shape of the stomach. So, things can fall into this area, but to get out of that area, there's going to have to be some muscular pumping of the food. And that's going to become important later too when we talk about the small intestine. So,
Yep.
These are the things that I remember to mention on the fly versus like making an entire slide about them. But it really is critical that we're all working with gravity in this digestive system.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Of course.
I don't have the pyloric sphincter anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that affects, I don't know.
Yeah, most people with the Whipple don't.
Okay.
And missing a large portion of the antrum too. And so Nina will talk a little bit more about what those portions of the stomach do and what you're losing in that case.
Okay.
Yep. There's some really important cells right in that area. And so that could definitely affect some normal aspects of gastrointestinal function. So, we all consume anything from, water to a 10-course meal to McDonald's or a salad at any time of day or night. And the GI tract needs to be set up in a very sophisticated way to absorb nutrients, promptly and also efficiently from these very different selections of food sources, while not wasting precious body reagents or energy. So this is accomplished by very close collaboration between hormones, which I mentioned earlier, and the control of motility or movement of what we call the enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system that runs throughout the gastrointestinal tract. So these are nerves and axons. This also has crosstalk with the central nervous system, which we think of as the brain and the spinal cord, which adds another layer of complexity. So hormones are chemicals that can flow through the blood system, through your blood vessels in the body, and these can control a single organ in the GI system or also regulate several organs at once to coordinate a very specific response to a meal. A great example of this is the secretion of insulin to help control blood sugar levels, but there are many other hormones involved in other aspects, such as appetite, or the feeling of fullness.
Yeah, and then think about when you see a meal. What happens when you see a meal that you haven't even eaten yet? Your stomach starts growling if you're hungry. You start to have a response that tells you how the central nervous system and the nervous system in general is interacting with this system.
Yeah, it's like you can see the dogs. If you have dogs at home, you know that if you even crinkle the food bag, they're salivating. So it's a very close relationship. One interesting fact is that the enteric nervous system is really its own, I don't want to say mini brain because it's really a big brain. This system contains somewhere around 80 to 100 million neurons. So this is a really complex, nuanced system that will help coordinate all of this movement and regulation of some of these hormones. And this happens via something we call the autonomic nervous system. So this provides the stomach with innervation that's both parasympathetic and sympathetic. And you might have heard of these nervous systems as the fight or flight response is one that people talk about a lot. So these are basically neuronal switches that can turn on and off basically the entire process of digestion. So I just wanted to have a slide on the nerves to point out that these nerves are absolutely crucial for almost every aspect of digestion. And some of these nerves do get altered or removed in the process of a Whipple for patients. So that is something important to consider as well. But not only nerves are important, we have to produce a lot of energy in the stomach to do this vigorous mixing and secrete these hormones. And so energy is really derived from a very rich blood supply that comes into the stomach. And then to remove waste, you have the venous system. So the red color across the stomach, this is the oxygenated blood pumping through the body, delivering oxygen to the cells, which is helping to produce energy. And then the blue system, the venous system, helps remove the waste from those cells. And so this provides that energy source in order for the stomach to be so mobile and, help with the process of digestion. So I just wanted to point out that the blood supply is also really important. And that's also really important to pancreatic cancer patients because where the tumor lies, some patients aren't eligible for surgery simply because the tumor is wrapping itself around, key blood vessels or veins. So it is something that is closely related to the cancer biology of this disease. So when we think about motility or movement, the gut muscle contractions really propel the contents all the way through the GI tract, mixing and grinding along the way. And this is crucial for absorption and also allows for storage until evacuation is appropriate. So the enteric nervous system, which we talked about earlier, controls this motility via very specific chemicals that are released in a time-dependent fashion from nerve axons to directly influence the muscle cells.
So Andrea, that goes directly to what you're asking about. So the idea that one of the side effects of the Whipple is the inability, you don't have the muscles anymore to push the food into the small intestine. You're relying almost completely on gravity at this point. So that's I think exactly what you were asking. Just give her a second. It looks like she might be trying to unmute. But maybe she's just taking notes. Okay.
Oh, so I was gonna say, so it's important to eat standing up or don't lay down because you don't have that?
You know, I'm not a clinician, but that makes perfectly logical sense to me because you are really,
That would
really
make
relying
logical
on
sense.
you're depending a lot on gravity now. Yeah.
Okay, all right, great, thank you.
I mentioned earlier that the regions of the stomach are important in that they have slightly different functions for what they do to help aid digestion. So the upper portion of the stomach, the fundus, and some of the body, which is about 85% of the organ, these are the areas that are mainly responsible for producing that really strong acid, hydrochloric acid, as well as producing a hormone called intrinsic factor and the pepsinogen, which will aid in breaking down specific proteins, as well as act as a sort of storage system for the digestive function as the process occurs. And the antrum, the lower portion, secretes or produces a very important hormone called gastrin and another hormone called somatostatin. And the movement of the antrum also further helps turn this food into a slurry of particles that are less than about 1 millimeter in diameter. And just to go into more detail with that, this is a picture on the right of at the cellular level what a gastric gland looks like. So in this image, each of these small boxes is actually one individual cell. And the circles inside the cell are the nucleus of the cell, which contains DNA. And then you can see a representation of kind of areas within the cell that have dots. And this is supposed to represent the granules that are containing those acid particles that get released into the space to help break down the food. So I just wanted to point out that actually there's a lot of researchers very focused on understanding the different functions in normal physiology and in disease of all these different cell types. So as you go from the top of this area down to the bottom, the composition of the cells changes. And actually those glands look very different depending on if you're in the top portion of the stomach or the bottom of the portion of the stomach. And so this does have consequences on normal physiology. So as I mentioned, the corpus contains specialized cells that make acid. These happen to be called parietal cells. There's also cells that make mucus that help coat the lining of the stomach, because you don't really want hydrochloric acid eating through your body. So that mucus layer is really important in protecting the normal tissue and cells. And then the lower portion of the stomach, the pylorus or antrum, also have mucus cells, but also contain G cells and D cells that make gastrin, the hormone I mentioned earlier, and somatostatin, another one that I mentioned.
So fun fact, it looks like Greg's going to ask a question, so I'm going to stop for a second.
I was just going to ask, I lost the bottom of the stomach and the pyloric sphincter. And so what functions did I lose and what impact is that having, like on the ability to digest food or to get it to come down? I know we talked about the dumping issue and I'm very familiar with that. You don't eat and lay down ever. You need the gravity. But chemically, what
I think
you lose?
it likely varies based on the individual, but it is possible that there is a lowered amount of release of this important hormone gastrin, which helps feed back to the parietal cells, which produce acid, to tell your stomach to make the appropriate amount of acid. And the same would go for somatostatin, which is the counterbalance to that. So you want to make some acid to digest your food, but you don't want to make too much. You don't want acid floating around in there when there's no food in there. So the somatostatin helps calm that down. So if you're missing a lot of the bottom portion of that stomach, there's likely a rewiring that needs to take place in order for the stomach to compensate for the loss of those particular chemicals. And it's not to say that there might not be some of those cells, further up into the stomach, but you might just have fewer of them.
Does the body adapt to that loss at all? I know I take
I would presume yes, but to be honest, I you know, I worked in the stomach field for a while. I certainly wasn't aware of any stomach researchers particularly focused on, you know, rewiring that occurs after a total pancreatectomy or after a Whipple. But I think that's a really interesting area of research that we should think about. But I don't know of anyone in particular. Howard might.
Well, I'm just going to say that throughout the GI tract, there's a large amount of cellular plasticity. That is to say, one cell can turn into something that mimics another cell, depending on the conditions, often in conditions of wound healing and such, or cancer. And certainly the stomach is no exception in the formation of gastric cancer. Gastritis, the epithelial cells, the cells that are making all these hormones, can turn into something that isn't quite what they should be. So the question that I think, as Nina's referring to, and there may be research that addresses this, and it would be really cool to go look into it. But does the absence of function cause the plasticity of a different cell to take on that identity? We usually look at it as a bad thing, but in this case, it would be a compensatory thing, and I think that would be. I agree. I will look it up. Nina will, and I will look it up and see if there is such a thing, because I think that would be a really interesting angle here, because a lot of times these wound healing effects are more direct. When the cells in the tissue that gets wounded changes, versus like the cells over here are missing, so we need to make more. That's a fascinating question that I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly what happens, but
Yeah.
probably not as good as the original.
Yeah, I'm amazed, just what you've gone through so far. The fact that my digestive system functions at all.
I know.
For the most part, I can eat anything I want to.
Functions very well, I
Yeah.
think, on a given day.
Yeah,
No, I think
I'm
it
astounded.
does. I
Yeah.
think from whence he began with very, very small increments of food and not being able to gain weight and so on. But I think he's come a tremendous way forward. And then I think so. I think he's doing better with that. But yes, and I appreciate the fullness of this, the intensity of talking about the different cells and the
Yeah.
different functions of those cells also in the digestive tract.
This really helps. Yeah.
It gives
Well-
him a much better understanding of what's occurring.
We're here
in
for all of you to
digestion.
do exactly that. So a fun fact, we'll just do the fun fact off to the side. So that the idea that since Nina's already introduced it, that the bacteria that causes ulcers, Helicobacter pylori, helico implies helicopter, right? And so it actually has a mechanism that causes like a little spinny drill on the bacteria and drills into that underneath that mucus. So now the mucus doesn't just protect the cells, it protects the bacteria. So she mentioned somehow they survive in this highly acidic environment. Well, that's how they hide out, but they hide out because they can drill into that mucus and protect themselves.
I
Yeah,
have another quick question.
Yeah.
It seems like I have a lot more gas than I used to. Does that have anything to do with losing some of these cells, or like this gastrin or whatever?
Not just this part, more than we're going to continue down the
Okay.
GI tract and you'll
Okay.
understand. And that's actually a very complex question, is what's actually causing that. It can be a number of things, and that's where we should bring this open for discussion.
Okay.
But and when we get through the rest of digestion, I think that'll be a good time to
Okay.
revisit. So I think I'm back on. So yeah, so here's our star of the hour, the pancreas. So I'm going to take over with the pancreas, not that Nina couldn't, but just because I've been doing this a little longer than she has. And so as you've figured out from the original figure I showed you, that the pancreas, we can expose it like this, but the pancreas is really hidden behind all these other organs we're talking about. So it's hidden behind the stomach. It's attached on one side at what's called the head of the pancreas, again, where most pancreatic cancers form, to the small intestine. We brought that up. Generally divided into head, body, and tail. The tail is attached to the spleen. It's not really wired into the spleen. It's just sort of attached to it. So when you have a complete pancreatectomy, generally the spleen is taken out as well. And I guess some of us know that. So there is then the spleen is of course important for some of your immune function and immune surveillance and throughout life. And so there's, as Greg can tell you, the idea that infections exist without any knowledge of them because there's not an immune response to them, which usually causes a lot of the symptoms of an infection is the immune response. So, but generally when you have a Whipple, the spleen remains intact, attached to the tail and the body that are still left and part of the head that's still left. But otherwise, you can see how everything fits together here. The small intestine, and we're going to talk a little bit at the end about the gallbladder. The gallbladder also, with its contents, fuses in with the bile duct here, and then right at the very tip, as it just joins the small intestine, fuses with the pancreatic duct. The pancreatic duct that's running through here is bringing all the digestive enzymes into the small intestine. And so the gallbladder, we're going to talk briefly about, it's involved in digestion of some fats, and you're going to lose that in the Whipple. And then this mixture of chyme or gall, whatever you call it, plus digestive enzymes right here deposits into the small intestine, where guess what, your food was just deposited coming from the stomach just a few minutes ago as either gravity or the muscles pushed it into the small intestine. So there's a couple of functions. Oops, somebody else is joining. I have to figure out where my mouse is, let them in. So the pancreas is considered to have two major functions, the endocrine function and the exocrine function. We all kind of know this, you maybe not hear it put that way, but the exocrine function is mostly through these cells that are really their only job is to make digestive enzymes. These are called the acinar cells. They put the digestive enzymes into the ductal system, and the ductal system will join to a bigger ductal system and eventually go to the small intestine. The other cell types we're talking about are the endocrine system. So this is the exocrine system deposits materials into a ductal system, and the endocrine system is going to deposit materials into the bloodstream. So of course we know the islets. Everyone has heard of islets, and that's the shorthand for islets of Langerhans. So the islets are made up of a lot of different cell types, but mainly we talk about beta cells, which make insulin, and alpha cells, which make glucagon, and then a couple others that we won't talk about. But so we know that glucose is important to regulate. High levels of glucose in your bloodstream can actually very negatively affect all kinds of functions, but particularly brain function. So it's really important that it's maintained at a very tight dose inside of your bloodstream. And so the insulin that's being produced by the beta cells is regulating that throughout your body, but at many different cell types, telling the cells to take in glucose and lower the amount of glucose. So if you have an absence of islets and you have an absence of beta cells, that's when you have high glucose, and that's what we call diabetes, right? So there's a few things to think about with regards to diabetes with this disease. One is that it's frequently associated with the formation of pancreatic cancer. So not just the Whipple, but with people that have pancreatic cancer, a large number of them get late onset diabetes, and sometimes that late onset diabetes is called late onset type 1 diabetes. So that means the absence of islet function, the absence of insulin. And then others are associated with type 2 diabetes, which many of us are dealing with as we get older, whether or not we've had a Whipple or whether we've not had pancreatic cancer. But there's an association, and these days, it used to be thought that it was a risk factor for pancreatic cancer. But there's a very fine line between the difference between a risk factor and an early indicator. So essentially a marker of the disease. And right now it looks like hyperglycemia, that is the lack of downregulation of your glucose, is a very early indicator of somebody that's going to develop pancreatic cancer. So depending on where in their life life they are, because generally that doesn't happen later in life. Type 2 diabetes is usually a lack of response to insulin, not a lack of production of insulin. So, so that's associated as potentially an early detection factor, as late onset type 1 diabetes and to a certain extent type 2 diabetes. But, and the other cells that I mentioned, the alpha cells that are generally lining the outside of this islet, is making glucagon, and the function of glucagon is essentially to have the opposite effect as insulin. And what it does is it communicates to cells within your liver, and it tells your liver to, what your liver has done over time is that if you haven't needed the glucose that's in your body, it's a major organ. A lot of cells do this, but the liver is a major organ that takes up the glucose that's in your bloodstream and will create essentially a polymer of glucose, and that's called glycogen. And so, so insulin will essentially tell the liver to make glycogen. Glucagon will tell the liver to break it down and put some glucose into the bloodstream. So does that make sense? And sometimes when I talk about pluses and minuses, ons and offs and things like that, I get myself confused. So I have to like think, is that the right direction? Pretty sure I got it right this time. So that's the major function of the islets is then to regulate glucose up and down. And so when you get the Whipple, of course, let's see what my next slide is. It's funny, I never use the presentation mode, but it's so small, it's not useful to me anyway. When you get the Whipple, there's a few things that happen, of course. So most of your islets, if you have the Whipple where you just get the head of the pancreas removed, then you still have lots of islets in the tail, and actually the tail of the pancreas that's against the spleen. In fact, most of your islets are in the tail of the pancreas. So generally, if you have a Whipple that's relatively well confined, you're usually pretty good at still regulating your blood glucose. Now, you're going to be impaired to some degree, and of course, there can be an adaptation, as we were talking about with the stomach, and over time it can get better, but it's also possible that it'll be permanent. And certainly, if you get a complete pancreatectomy, you are not going to be able to regulate your glucose and you become insulin dependent. And then the other point about, the pancreas, so you lose some of your endocrine function, you're also going to lose some of your exocrine function, and the exocrine function goes back to digestion. So the digestive enzymes, the main source of your digestive enzymes are the exocrine portion of the pancreas. So we've talked about acid, we talked about hormones, but these are the proteins, the enzymes that are specifically there to break down protein, to break down sugar, and to break down fat. So peptidases, amylases, and lipases, respectively. And so by losing a significant portion of the pancreas, you could develop something that is called pancreatic insufficiency. That this can happen under a number of conditions. It could happen with severe chronic pancreatitis, certainly any kind of surgery you have in the pancreas that can compromise this function. You have not enough digestive enzymes to be able to digest your food, and I know at this point I'm preaching to the choir. So yeah, you break down you've got your chunks of, really small chunks, as Nina's explained, of food that's entered the small intestine, and you've got the digestive enzymes also entering the small intestine. And then, as we'll talk about in a second, maybe this is all I'll say about the small intestine, the main function of the duodenum is to defy gravity, first of all. Notice how it goes, parallel here or perpendicular to the, so parallel to the ground, perpendicular to your body, so the food gets a little bit caught here. And the function of the small intestine is to start mixing the food, the digestive enzymes, and the gallbladder, the chyme, what's called, all together. Because remember, the bile duct and the gallbladder contents are coming from this duct, digestive enzymes coming from this duct, so they're coming to the same spot. They're being kind of stuck here with the food because it's not falling straight down, and just mixing, so digesting, so that that they can be absorbed by the various cells within the intestine, the small intestine, and the large intestine. So you notice how the intestine just looks like a really long snake. The whole idea is that you're just trying to increase the time that you expose those cells to the nutrients that they can absorb. If it went just straight down and you just it wouldn't have time to really absorb all the nutrients that your body needs. So I guess I'm going to just do all my slides in this slide because it's a good slide to do it. So the idea then, you're going to lose part of the pancreas, going to get pancreatic insufficiency potentially. Your food is not being broken down, and you're also going to lose part of you're going to lose your gallbladder. And so again, not being broken down, and you're going to lose this part of your duodenum. I said he can't pronounce it wrong, so I'm going to pronounce it both ways. That causes this this stall in the progression of your food just in time for it to get mixed together. So there's all kinds of reasons that your food is not being properly digested once you've lost these parts of your digestive tract. So this is why many people that get the Whipple and the pancreatectomy, you have to say digestive enzymes in the form of a pill. And it's always, in my knowledge, and I'm sure if we just compare notes with all of you, it is a journey to find the right dose for you. And the reason for that is you might not have lost as much of your small intestine, or you lost more of your small intestine, or less of your pancreas, more of your pancreas. So it's all about essentially experimentation till you're comfortable with how you're able to digest your food. And so there's no one size fits all. There's a general range, but there's no one size fits all. I did mention the liver already as a place that your glucose is stored in polymers, but the liver has a lot of other functions. You know that it's involved in regulation of first of all, it produces some of the components of the bile duct and the gallbladder, so it's actually involved in breaking down fat. It's also where a lot of detox is happening, so alcohol detox and etc. And drug detox, and sometimes in a lot of our cases, drug activation is happening in this organ as well. So most of us know that we don't want to live without a liver. As some people say, it's right in the word live. If you don't have a liver, you don't live. So it's a really important organ, but with regards to what we're talking about, there's some digestive function and there's some storage of glucose that's happening. And then the gallbladder, as I've already mentioned, you're going to lose this part and you're going to keep this part. So there's no storage of the chyme and the various fluids, and it's not enzymes so much as what's called bile salts. It's stuff that help break down fat. And so one of the reasons, because you've lost this storage of this chyme, and you can synthesize it, but you don't store it, so you can't just put a big bolus of it into your small intestine when you eat. That's one of the main reasons that once you have the Whipple, you're supposed to be on a low-fat diet as much as possible. That sounds familiar, I hope. But generally, that's one of the things that's harder to deal with, because let's face it, we get older. It's like we're like, screw it, I want some fat. I want to have a hamburger, but you shouldn't really do that. And so I mentioned everything about the duodenum already. Again, a place where the gravity stops and everything gets mixed together. So I don't need to repeat that. And I think that's really where I wanted to stop. To give you back to the overview. This is not drawn correctly because you can see that the duodenum doesn't have the little fold it should have to block the gravity. So some cartoons are wrong, but otherwise it gives you the idea. The rest of it is all about absorption and expulsion, think, of course, and not compromised by the Whipple. So I think that's where my last slide is. Yes, it is. So let's have a discussion.
All right, I've got a question that's come up a couple of times, and that is, you just mentioned low-fat diet, and that runs counter to one of the first pieces of advice I had from my surgeon. He said he wanted me to butter my toast on both sides, and he said, no more skim milk, no more margarine. You're going to do real butter, whole milk, and all of that. And I was kind of baffled at first. And he said, I need you to build up energy because your body isn't going to process the fats very well anymore. So you actually need to increase your fat intake. But
the right kind of fat, I'm pretty sure. So you don't want anything that you have to do with, highly processed fat like molecules, so that you can. But some also very simple fats that you can break down relatively easily with a minimum amount of digestive enzymes that you can then absorb. So I understand where that comes from, but when you start getting into more complex fats and polyunsaturated and all that stuff, these are going to cause a lot more trouble than.
Okay, so that's why fried chicken is off of my palate, and pizza in particular.
Life without pizza, I do
pepperoni.
not envy you. Oh, well, pepperoni, that's okay. There's other things to put on a pizza.
Now, just to continue on that fat issue, so what fats are better than others? I know that fried food, it's a more difficult fat to break down. I have more trouble with that. But foods like avocados, I have no trouble with, and cheese and stuff like that.
Well, I'm not going to take the place of the nutritionist, and we're going to leave those questions for them, because if I contradict them, you're going to be just confused about what I would think, but I'm probably also wrong.
I'm a retired dietitian who also had a total pancreatectomy and all that. So as far as the fats goes, the fats that are more liquid at room temperature are better than the hard fats. Anything that gets hard, like beef fat, is considered not as good fat, but the oils,
Right.
That type of thing is better.
Which brings up the idea that the oils in particular, olive oil, that sort of thing, is completely broken down, but it's also really simple. It doesn't require a lot of digestion itself.
Right.
It's mostly can be absorbed without much processing. So yeah, great way to put it. And so now I've learned something.
I was told at Mayo Clinic that MCT oil, you don't have to use Creon with it, and it helped me gain weight, whatever. And I put that in my shakes and stuff. So that helped me.
Triglyceride oil is what that is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So already broken down into triglycerides. So there's really not much processing that has to happen at all.
Yeah, one of the other areas that I still struggle with a little bit is vitamin absorption. I know that my only source of iron now is from my daily supplements, my vitamin pills, because you lose the spleen and you lose the duodenum. The top 3 inches of the duodenum is responsible like 70% of the iron absorption. And then the spleen produces the remainder by reprocessing the old red blood cells. But vitamin A has still been a difficult one. And I wanted to know if either of you knew which parts of the system that gets taken out absorbs vitamin A. Because we're trying a backdoor. The vitamin A supplements, both the wet and the dry versions, the oil soluble and the regular. Neither one of those types worked at any dosage. So we're trying a backdoor approach using beta carotene, which in the body, some of it breaks down into vitamin A. But I'm up to 75,000 IUs of beta carotene a day now. And I've got another blood test coming up in a week or so to see if that's solved the problem. But if you lose all of the tissue for a vitamin absorption like vitamin A, is there any backdoor way of getting it into the bloodstream?
I don't really know. I mean, what you do know is that vitamin A is absorbed primarily by the duodenum mucosal cells, which you've lost. So no mystery that you can't absorb it. But as far as a workaround, again, that's a great question for the nutritionist. But I'm going to guess that you are talking to a nutritionist. Veronica might want to jump in. I don't know.
Well, I don't have. I'm not sure on that. I should have got that. I don't know. I'm retired, remember, it's been a few years. I mean, I retired I had all my surgeries for pancreatic cancer. That was in 2006. And so I've been out since about 2008. I retired, I think.
Right.
Well,
So
that's fair.
It's been a way. Certain things come back. A lot of things you're presenting surely come back in my brain, but
Well, all I can say is vitamins by definition are things that you need and you absolutely have to have. So there must be a workaround. You either are absorbing really low levels of it and that's sufficient to keep you from, being
Yeah,
on.
I would think, I remember my surgeon after my surgery, he said, don't worry, you've got plenty of absorptive tissue in there that, but I'm reviewing this stuff about all these major things are absorbed at the top of your small intestine. So I would assume that it doesn't mean nothing is being absorbed the rest of the way.
Yeah, generally it's a gradient of, the cells don't disappear entirely. It's just the vast majority of them are in this part or another. Another thing we didn't talk about, and I'm probably dangerous to even bring it up, is the microbiome is very different in all of these compartments besides the stomach that only has a few things that can survive. But in the intestine, the microbiome changes and from the duodenum to the different parts of the intestine so that I think it would be potentially a topic for one of your talks, Greg, is that how this would be affected and what the bottom line is, because we can't live without the microbiome doing its thing.
That's a good topic. I think about it, but it never occurred to me that we really need to address that, because I wasn't sure there was a lot of information about pre to post Whipple effects on microbiome.
Well, in the approach that we took is maybe a better idea would be to say this is the natural function of the microbiome in different parts of the body, and then we can hypothesize what the changes will be. There's a researcher at U of M who specializes in the microbiome and the pancreas and its effects on pancreatic cancer formation, but she should be qualified. She's an MD, so also be qualified to discuss the natural functions.
Oh,
but we do
fantastic.
we do know that the bacteria that are involved in this is that that there are effects on formation of pancreatic cancer for certain. And that's all coming mostly from the permeability from the small intestine into the pancreas. And that's what's something about the permeability of your intestine changes during the early stages of the disease, and also during pancreatitis, if you happen to get pancreatitis. And so that potentially changes the microbiome that in the pancreas itself that can lead to cancer, or at least contribute to cancer.
Interesting. Is there a possible connection? I have a large diverticuli on the transverse colon that was laying right up against the pancreas. Could there have been a change in the environment around that?
I am not the expert, but yeah, sure. I mean, that sounds like a pretty suspicious thing that was going on.
Yeah, because I've only read little snippets about the idea that there is a bacterial environment around the pancreatic cancer as it develops.
Yeah, bacterial and fungal. So and yes, the permeability of the intestine to these, it changes with alcohol, changes with pancreatitis, it changes with all kinds of things that we only vaguely appreciate. So it would be a topic that potentially a better expert than I could address with you guys.
Good. Hopefully with the increase in the number of people surviving the initial cancer, like the group here tonight, there will be more interest in looking into these issues.
Oh, there's always interest. It's a matter of what can we find out with the people who are willing to help us, really, when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
Right. And you intensively work on what you can, when you can. And some questions remain unanswerable, obviously, because we're dealing with the human body and the complexities, and all human beings, human bodies have a variety of complexities. So with or without cancer. So it's, it's so, but you have been very thorough. I had a simple question about the blood vessels, the veins and the arteries in the stomach, understanding that process. How are those impacted through chemotherapy treatments, since chemotherapy alters the state of the tumor, does it alter the state of any of the veins or arteries that supplant the stomach or the pancreas? Does chemotherapy alter how those veins and arteries function?
Yeah, that's a really good question. At the macro level, I'm not entirely sure of the answer, but I know of a researcher who has studied the different types of cells that actually make up the veins and the arteries. So those are made up of cells. Those are called
Right,
endothelial
right.
cells. There's different kinds of endothelial cells that have different, slightly different functions. And I know that his group, this is Mass General, they did show that genes expressed in the endothelial cell were shifted by chemotherapy. So that could impact the function of the veins and arteries. I don't particularly know exactly how, but it could definitely shift some of the functionality of those cells temporarily. And I know the chemotherapy also can affect the nerves as well, that are also really important, we talked about. So both of those components, I think, could be impacted.
Are either of you familiar with a gastric condition that relates to eosinophils? And
Eosinophils?
yes.
Not in the stomach, but I know of like eosinophilic esophagitis, which is the condition that can affect
Yes,
the
yes,
esophagus. Yeah.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Can that be an outgrowth or a risk factor or anything with, I have a great nephew who is a leukemia survivor, but he's apparently recently had this condition. So he's unable to digest food correctly. He's unable to even swallow, get the food.
Yeah. No, it's a
Okay.
very serious condition.
Right.
Yeah, I
Ian,
don't know if there's a relationship. That's
Okay,
that's something I could look into, but I'm not
Right.
sure off the top
Right.
of my head. Because I
okay.
think that's more of like an immune driven
I think-
disorder, and I don't think
right,
they
I
even
think
fully
it is as
understand
well.
what causes
Right.
it.
yeah,
Right.
he and I were in chemotherapy at the same time. And I remember right before every session, I would get an injection of a steroid, and the nurses told me, well, that was to protect the blood vessels, from the chemicals damaging them. And so that got me to thinking about, okay, what's happening to the blood vessels in my brain and my heart and in my lungs?
Yeah, because a lot of chemotherapies are just going to target cells that are in the process of dividing.
Yeah.
So normal cells do have to divide as well. Yes, at a slower rate than tumor cells, but they definitely can be compromised.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And you had mentioned about, what we could do with, by studying the people that are surviving longer. I have proposed to Greg that there's another side to life after Whipple, and that's what happens to the tumor once we take it out. So what happens to its so-called life? That we'd be happy to come back and talk about some of that, because Henry Ford, that's what Nina's pointing to. That's a human tumor that came out of a patient, and she's exploring what's going on in the biology of that. So yeah, but that
That's
would
definitely important information, definitely.
yeah.
The last time I was at Mayo Clinic in May 10th, they asked if I would be part of a study. So I guess they keep our tumors,
Mhm.
and they were going to, so I had already done my blood work for the day. So I went back afterwards and did more blood work, and then they were gonna slice my tumor, and they were trying to figure out if I ever got this back, if they could inject something into me to help my specific body type or something. I don't know what it was. They asked me if I would be in a study. So I haven't heard any more, but I'm apparently in a study at Mayo Clinic about helping.
Well,
I don't know.
we're in a small group here, so if you need translation of what that study is, if you want to give us the information, we're happy to translate what they're doing.
Okay.
So we're all excited about a study that's been done at Memorial Sloan Kettering by one of our colleagues that has been taking the tumor, sequencing the tumor, finding out what the mutations are in the tumor and which ones the immune response should respond to, and then
Mhm,
creating a mRNA vaccine like we've been getting with COVID vaccines that
mhm.
encode for all those unique non-self antigens, so to speak, so that then injecting the individual patient with that, and the immune cells become trained on those antigens, and then will attack the tumor, and the early results look really quite fantastic. So
That's what I think. Could that be something I'm part of? They said that out of the 100% of them they're working on, Mayo Clinic got 50%, and then all the other hospitals got the other 50%. Is that something possible that I'm part of? I don't know.
well, there's lots of clinical trials going on, so I
Okay.
don't want to, I have
Yeah, I
no
don't know.
idea what they're doing, but
I
if you get a description of what they're doing, or if they've given you any kind of information, then just send it
I
to
can.
us.
Okay, all right, I'll ask for that. Okay.
Right, there's a number of things going on right now. The one, Howard, I think you were referring to, tries to target the cancer itself while it's still in the body.
Right.
The other one that Immunovia is working on right now, a new corporation that just merged with Nant Quest. They're looking at a vaccine for people who have had the Whipple procedure, have had the cancer removed, but to prevent it from returning, because
Oh.
the recurrence of pancreatic cancer is a very high rate.
Yeah, of course, and yeah. So I don't know what they're doing with people that, I mean, these are people that are getting biopsies and surgery and having their tumors sequenced, and of course, I don't know, and it's a very small number of patients right now. But do you remember, Nina, if it was done through resection? Because that would be essentially
remember.
preventive for coming back.
Yeah.
If it's done with biopsy, that's at diagnosis, so that's there to try to kill the tumor while it's in the body. So it should be effective. The nice thing about immune therapy is that it's a surveillance therapy. That is to say, yes, it might kill the main tumor, which was really large, so it might not because it's so big, but the surgery will take that out. But it's the residual disease that the immune system goes everywhere in the body, and if the tumor is anywhere in the body, it will find it and kill it. So that's the idea. The whole concept of immune therapy is that you don't have to have, if you have recurrence, you get chemo and it's too late by that time. This is like to prevent you ever to getting to that point where you have recurrence at all.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that vaccine.
Well, we'll see what we can do. Supposedly Henry Ford is going to be involved in that trial soon. I'm anxious to see it, to get confirmation on that.
What we're told.
Yeah. Put me on the list.
A
I
very,
didn't know too much about the low-fat diet. I guess I didn't know too much about that.
Well, I think that Greg and Veronica, clarified that quite a bit. It's not so much low fat as you don't want
The proper fat.
yeah, you want the proper fat. Oils are, I really want to emphasize what Veronica said, because I was reading about that just today, is that oils are generally fine.
Okay.
And again, not like, you don't want Crisco because solid room temperature,
Oh.
Veronica. It's
No, no Crisco.
butter
Okay.
butter melts at room temperature, Greg. So the butter on both sides makes sense.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, and Andrea, your original question about the gas production.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
find that with difficult to digest fats, gas is a major problem.
And
Yeah.
but Nina, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally, gas production has a lot to do with your microbiome. So are the bacteria that remain able to process some of the food products that you have left over after you've done the digestion? You can, and if your digestion's more limited, the bacteria potentially can't compensate, or if it does compensate, it just produces a lot of sulfur dioxide, and that's gas.
Yeah, that's gas.
That's a small presentation I'd like us to get put together, and it has to do with, when I found out I had this staph infection, I had to go on a very strong antibiotic. The first one didn't work at all. Then they put me on Cipro, and which is a That's a
Simple.
sledgehammer kind of antibiotic. It wiped out everything in my digestive system. And I'm on an antifungal already, and then I was on an antiviral. So I was on antibiotic, antiviral, and antifungal all at the same time, which means I've got no stomach biota left at all.
But
And it
here's-
takes a while to grow back, and it doesn't always grow back as robust as it was before.
Here's the joke, he's not anti-life, so he's, you know, he's still here. So
Still kicking.
just keep
Still
him
kicking.
going. Just
Yeah.
keep him going.
But if nobody else has any other questions, I would like to just thank both
Yes.
Dr. Crawford,
Very
Dr.
good.
Steele, Howard, and Nina for doing this presentation. It was very, very,
Yeah, it was very good.
Our
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you
very
for
much our
having us.
pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford.
Okay, thank you.
Very
Thank
welcome.
you.
Dr. Steele.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you
All right.
soon.
good night, everyone. We'll see you next month.
Good night. Take care.
Good night.